Hey guys, tonight we wander back in time, way back, to the echoing stone alleys and mossy rooftops of 14th century Paris. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp straw. You're strolling just past curfew, hood up, lantern swinging gently in your hand. Up above, the skies are dusky purple, and the little flocks of pigeons cluster on roof ridges and bell towers like they own the place. Spoiler, they kind of do. Because in this sleepy corner of medieval history, pigeons aren't just cooing nuisances. They're feathered symbols of power, legally protected aristocratic assets, and sometimes the literal cause of neighborly turf wars. And if you think that's weird, well, try wrapping your head around the fact that in some parts of 14th century France, killing a pigeon, especially the wrong pigeon, could land you in actual court with actual punishments. You probably won't survive this intellectually. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I love reading that part. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're now moving slowly past Notre Dame, well before its spire caught fire, back when it loomed over the Seine like a stone sermon. On the rooftops above, a dozen pigeons perch on wooden crossbeams, and not a single Parisian would dare knock them down. Why? Because in the 1300s, pigeons weren't pests, they were prestige. Specifically, they were the property of nobility, and Paris had laws protecting them with the same level of seriousness you'd expect for a prized war horse or your neighbor's ox. You squint up. That dovecote near the roofline? That's not just a birdhouse. It's a registered real estate feature. The family living there might not even own the house, but if they've got noble blood, they might legally own the birds. It's one of those quirks of medieval logic, like how your lord can marry off your daughter without asking, but can't technically make toast because only the monks had bread ovens in your village. The idea was simple, if unfair. Only nobles were allowed to keep pigeons because only nobles were considered trustworthy enough to let their birds fly freely over others' land. The assumption? Peasants, being of lesser moral fiber, obviously, would let their birds ravage crops like winged bandits. Nobles, on the other hand, were believed to raise well-mannered pigeons. Despite all evidence to the contrary, you pause near a market square. Even here, signs of pigeon respect or resentment are everywhere. Shopkeepers hang wooden hawks to try and scare them off. A woman selling radishes hisses as a bird lands on her cart, but she doesn't touch it. You remember why? The penalties for harming a pigeon weren't just financial. In some towns, cutting down a noble's bird could result in you being whipped, branded, or, if you really pushed it, losing a hand. There's a recorded case in Brittany where a farmer was fined a third of his harvest for daring to shoot a pigeon with a sling. Historians still argue whether this was an isolated overreaction or part of a broader trend of absurd animal protectionism. A breeze lifts your cloak. The city smells of roasted onions and wet limestone. Pigeons flutter overhead. You wonder, what made them so special? Well, food, for one. Pigeons were a sustainable, self-replicating food source, which made them invaluable in a world without refrigeration. Their poop, rich in nitrogen, was also prized as fertilizer, especially for vineyards. But more than anything, pigeons were about image. Owning birds that could leave your property, fly freely, and still choose to return, that was seen as the ultimate flex. They were tiny flying serfs, loyal to your dovecote, and therefore proof of your divine right to own land. You pass a statue near the old guild hall, 1 foot missing, pigeons nesting under its robe. You can almost hear a medieval city council groaning. Bird control wasn't really a thing. There were no nets, no ultrasonic beepers, just escalating complaints and endless laws about who could own what. And pigeons were the epicenter of that battle. Imagine this. A commoner dares to build a dovecote, maybe just a small one, tucked behind his bakery. The birds breed as pigeons do, and soon they're flapping over into the local baron's wheat fields. A month later, the baker's front door gets nailed shut with a writ of violation, accusing him of trespass via bird. It's like being arrested because your dog barked at the wrong person. Except your dog also fertilized the neighbor's orchard and ruined his barley harvest. You lean against a cool stone wall, listening to the soft flap above. The truth is, the pigeon laws weren't just about birds. They were about control, about who could exploit the land and who just worked it. The nobles didn't eat all the pigeon meat themselves. They often sold or gifted it. But the key was that they owned the rights, just as they owned the mills, the presses, and often the airspace above their fields. And don't worry, we'll get to airspace in a bit. Spoiler, it's stranger than you think. The Paris of this time is caught in a strange balance. It's a city of spires and thatched roofs, of overflowing gutters and delicate cheese carts. But perched somewhere between daily grind and divine right are pigeons, not just tolerated, worshipped in their weird little way, protected by parchment, by edict, and by the blade. A pigeon coos right above your head. You smile, sleepily, and step forward. There's a long night ahead, and a lot of feathers still to ruffle. Dot, you turn a corner, your boots making soft thuds against the damp cobbles. The city quiets, and all you can hear now is the rhythmic gurgle of the Seine and the distant, almost comical cooing of pigeons echoing off the stone walls. And as you follow the birds with your eyes, you notice them not just on rooftops, but fluttering in and out of an ornate wooden tower perched above a manor house. Yes, another dovecote. Now here's where the pigeons start to annoy people, Dot. Because while nobles adored their pigeons, pampered them even, the peasants, well, they mostly wanted them gone. Picture this. You've worked for months to grow enough wheat to last the winter. Every kernel matters. Then, here come 20 snooty, entitled pigeons descending like feathered aristocrats onto your field, helping themselves to your livelihood. And guess what? You can't touch them. Legally, you have to let them eat, like they're royal guests at your wedding. Pigeon ownership was one of many symbols of feudal privilege. If you were a noble, you didn't need a reason. You had a right. And that right was tied to land ownership, not the amount of land, but the class of landowner. A peasant with 100 acres couldn't build a dovecote. A baron with 5 acres? Absolutely. And his birds were free to flap their gluttonous way through every neighbor's barley patch without consequence. You pass a hay cart parked outside a tavern. A group of workers, tired, muddy, and halfway through their beer, are grumbling. One gestures toward the sky and mutters something bitter in Old French. You don't speak it fluently, but it sounds a lot like sky rats with legal immunity. The tension wasn't just economic, it was deeply symbolic. The birds became emblems of inequality. Noble pigeons were a living reminder that your work wasn't entirely your own. It belonged, in part, to whatever bird happened to poop on it, so long as that bird had the right pedigree. Now, here's the kicker. Nobles didn't always need to feed their flocks. The countryside itself became the buffet. Pigeons would roam for miles, nibbling at newly sown seeds or juicy young sprouts. So, the more pigeons a noble had, the more he was indirectly bleeding his peasant neighbors dry. In fact, some nobles boasted about the range of their pigeons, like proud parents of honor students. A dovecote with 500 birds? That wasn't a coop. It was a status symbol, a sky fortress of superiority. And you, humble farmer, couldn't even raise your slingshot without risking a visit from the sheriff. There were attempts to regulate it. Some towns tried imposing pigeon limits. Others restricted when birds could fly. Yes, pigeon curfews. But these efforts rarely worked. Nobles simply claimed that limiting their birds was an attack on their divine rights. And honestly, who was going to argue with a guy in chainmail who could literally tax your ox into the ground? You pause to rest beneath an elm tree, just outside a little village square. There's a man tending to his garden, hands calloused, shoulders bowed. You can tell he's tried everything. Nets, scarecrows, curses muttered at dawn. But the pigeons keep coming. They always do. And here's a juicy tidbit. Some peasants tried to beat the system by keeping secret pigeons. Underground dovecotes, hidden in barns, disguised behind hay bales, or carved into hollow trees. It was the black market of bird husbandry. If caught, the punishment could be severe, not just for owning pigeons, but for daring to pretend you were someone who could. Historians still argue whether these underground flocks were widespread or just isolated cases. But court records from rural France hint at more than a few accidental pigeon deaths, followed by very formal apologies and much heavier fines. As you move again, and the air smells faintly of garlic and fresh horse dung. The birds fly overhead like they don't have a care in the world, and that's because they really don't. They're protected, not just by law, but by the unshakable weight of feudal hierarchy. Even the church got in on the act. Monasteries, believe it or not, were allowed massive dovecotes. Why? Because monks needed pigeons for religious purposes. Like casseroles and compost. But we'll get to those sneaky monks in a bit. For now, picture the absurdity. You, a peasant, sow your grain. You pray for good weather. And just when the crops begin to sprout, whoosh, a flock of noble birds swoops in like airborne tax collectors. You can't harm them. You can't shoo them too hard. All you can do is glare into the sky and hope the next field over looks tastier. And here's a twist. Sometimes, nobles offered their pigeons to peasants. "Why don't you raise them for us?" they'd say, like they were doing you a favor. But the deal always leaned one way. You fed them, cleaned the droppings, and got nothing but noise in return. The meat, reserved for the Lord's table. The droppings, shipped to the vineyards. The peasants, still hungry. The logic of the system was warped, but airtight. If you questioned it, you weren't just being difficult. You were questioning the order of the world. And in 14th century France, that was a bold move for someone who probably didn't own a pair of shoes. You step back onto the road, watching a distant dovecote glow in the candlelight. The pigeons inside are probably dozing now, fluffed and warm, fed on stolen grain and protected by 1,000 years of tradition. Somewhere nearby, a farmer sighs as he boards up his shed, his crops a little lighter than they were this morning. And in the chill of the evening, the imbalance sits thick in the air, just like the feathers drifting down around you. Your feet crunch softly along a gravel path now, taking you into the quiet of the countryside just beyond the city walls. The sky is darker here, a deep velvet curtain, and the stars blink above like tiny, watchful eyes. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls once for the hour, and from a nearby estate, you spot the silhouette of a dovecote rising like a wooden crown above the treetops. Not a small one either. This is a full-blown colombier, a pied, a freestanding dovecote with thick stone walls, a rounded roof, and tiny arched entry holes just for the birds. It looks like a medieval missile silo, except instead of launching rockets, it houses up to 2,000 pigeons at once. You blink. This isn't just animal husbandry. It's aristocratic absurdity. See, these dovecotes were no accident. They were built with meticulous attention to status. The inside walls were lined with hundreds of little niches, each one a pigeon apartment with rent, paid in feathers, and a hearty appetite. The wealthier the landowner, the bigger the dovecote. Some were round, others square, but all had one job: to impress your friends and silently infuriate your tenants. You walk slowly around the base of the structure, your fingers brushing moss-covered stone. There's a narrow wooden door, locked of course, and a small slanted window near the top for light and air. Historians still argue whether these windows were primarily for ventilation or just a clever way to show off your pigeon wealth to jealous visitors. Now get this. Owning a dovecote was such a symbol of privilege that its very construction was controlled by law. If you weren't a noble, you couldn't build one. Period. In fact, some regions even specified the number of pigeons you were allowed to keep, based on how many arpents of land you held. But guess who usually wrote those laws? Yeah, the ones with the biggest flocks. You glance up at a beam protruding from the roof. It's stained white, naturally. A few pigeons are nestled up there, totally indifferent to your presence. Just another human passing by, unimportant and unarmed. But centuries ago, if you had dared to harm one of them, you'd be in deep feudal trouble. And here's a strange but true fringe fact. Some dovecotes had central, rotating ladders or poles inside, allowing keepers to access all the pigeonholes with ease. Think of it as a lazy Susan for birds. You'd climb in, spin the center beam, and gather eggs or chicks as needed. And yes, pigeon meat was very much on the menu. In noble households, pigeon pie was practically a requirement, served hot alongside sauces that smelled suspiciously of overripe plums and ambition. The meat was considered clean, not religiously, but socially. Unlike pigs or goats, pigeons weren't low animals. They were dignified, a bit snooty, edible tokens of divine favor. If you hosted a banquet and didn't serve at least a couple roasted pigeons, people whispered. They said things like, "Poor dear probably lost his fields," or "Shame about his dovecote. It only holds 600. But again, while nobles enjoyed the luxury, peasants got the mess. Because as you keep wandering the edge of the estate, you notice something else. The land here is oddly bare. Trampled, sparse. Aha, pigeon fallout. When you keep thousands of birds in one place, the ground beneath them turns, let's say, less than fertile. Sure, the droppings were great as fertilizer when collected properly, but left to accumulate? It was a smelly, acidic nightmare. Peasants hated it, especially when the birds weren't theirs. You sit on a fallen log now, watching the dovecote in the moonlight. The symmetry is lovely if you ignore the politics, like a small cathedral devoted entirely to wings, droppings, and aristocratic ego. The whole structure hums with historical irony, a monument to food security for the few, built at the expense of the many. And while we're being honest, nobles didn't do all the pigeon keeping themselves. Of course not. They had valets de colombier, essentially pigeon butlers. These unlucky souls cleaned the nests, gathered the eggs, and shooed away hawks. One misstep, and a whole flock might panic, fly into someone else's land, and cause a diplomatic disaster. Imagine losing your job because a bird had bad aim. Now, here's a quirky twist. In some areas of France, especially Normandy, dovecotes were considered part of a woman's dowry. You heard that right. Marrying into the right family didn't just get you a few goats. It might get you a pigeon tower, a literal house full of birds. Romantic, right? I give you my name, my fortune, and this cylindrical building full of squawking dependents. You chuckle quietly as a pigeon flaps overhead, offended perhaps by your sarcasm. Or maybe just looking for its perch. Let's not forget, these dovecotes were also strategically important. In times of war, yes, even medieval sieges, pigeons were used to send messages. Carrier pigeons could relay orders across enemy lines, assuming they weren't intercepted by hungry archers. There are scattered reports of pigeon warfare tactics, kings sending decoy birds, or enemies trying to shoot down the feathered messengers before they made it home. Whether these stories are myth or just exaggerated chronicles, historians still argue. But regardless, the dovecote wasn't just a barn. It was a symbol, a food source, a communication hub, and a weapon, all rolled into one beautifully inconvenient bird tower. As you stand again, stretching your limbs, The wind rustles the trees and sends another cluster of pigeons fluttering skyward. The building looms behind you, silent and solemn, filled with birds who don't know or care that their ancestors once ruled the rural skies like tiny airborne landlords. And as you walk away, the path winding deeper into the fields, one last thought drifts with you into the night. Sometimes power doesn't roar. Sometimes it coos. The road dips gently now, and your boots press into softer earth. Farmland stretches ahead of you like a dark patchwork quilt. Row after row of barley, wheat, beans. A small wooden cart sits abandoned on the edge of a field, its wheels crooked, its frame dusted with straw and soot. A few pigeons peck lazily at seeds someone spilled near the cart's axle. You crouch, watching them. They're chubby, unhurried, oddly smug. It's no wonder peasants saw them less like birds and more like floating taxes. Sometimes power doesn't roar. Sometimes it coos. This is where the feud deepens. Because when we talk about pigeon law, we're also talking about land. Who owns it? Who profits from it? And who gets to suffer for it? In the 14th century, France wasn't one big kingdom in the way we think of countries now. It was a mosaic of fiefdoms, all overlapping in a mess of feudal obligations, and the pigeon debate was tangled right in the middle of it. Sometimes power doesn't roar. Sometimes it coos. If you were a peasant, you likely rented land from a lord, who rented land from a bigger lord, who maybe owed allegiance to a duke, who in turn bowed, a bit grudgingly, to the king. And somewhere, high up that chain, was a guy with a dovecoat full of birds that ate your crops. And you couldn't say a thing. This wasn't just about dinner. It was about hierarchy. And nowhere was that clearer than in the strange phenomenon of feathered jurisdiction. That's right. Lords didn't just claim the land. They claimed the air above the land. Their pigeons didn't need permission to feed in your barley because technically that airspace still belonged to the Lord. So while you might be the one weeding the field, sowing the grain, and praying for rain, your Lord's pigeons could come snack on your hard work because their flight path was protected. And as ridiculous as that sounds, the logic made sense in a feudal kind of way. The birds were part of the land, and the land belonged to the noble. End of discussion. Except peasants weren't always great at staying quiet. Some historians point to records of field sabotage, traps hidden beneath straw, poison-laced grain scattered just before harvest. Of course, getting caught meant serious consequences, but the bitterness ran deep, and the higher the pigeon population, the higher the resentment. In one memorable case near Orléans, a village reportedly filed a formal petition to have a local lord's dovecote reconsidered due to crop destruction. The outcome? The pigeon stayed. The village was taxed more heavily the next year. Classic. You wander past a scarecrow now. It leans forward like it's had a hard day, arms sagging, hat askew. One pigeon perches on its shoulder anyway, bold as brass. Scarecrows, it turns out, weren't terribly effective against legally untouchable birds. And here's the kicker. Some nobles didn't even live near their dovecotes. They stayed in the city, sipping wine and trading gossip, while their flocks feasted on other people's harvests miles away. The birds would return home each night to roost, bellies full, leaving the damage behind. And since the owners were nowhere nearby, there was no one for angry peasants to confront, except perhaps a particularly unlucky steward or clerk. By the way, fun fringe fact, some medieval farmers tried decoy dovecotes. They'd build small wooden frames to lure pigeons away from real crops, using a mix of salted grain, leftover bread, and sheer desperation. These fake feeding stations worked occasionally until the Lord's men came knocking, suspicious that someone was interfering with pigeon rights. Imagine explaining to a bailiff that, no, you weren't trying to starve the noble's birds, just gently redirect them. Meanwhile, the nobles justified everything. They'd say things like, the pigeons are part of the natural order, or the damage is minimal, or peasants benefit from pigeon fertilizer anyway. One lord even argued that pigeon droppings helped keep his tenants humble, a strange claim that makes you wonder what he was drinking. The truth, though, was more bureaucratic than sinister. Pigeon ownership was tied to land grants and feudal agreements centuries old. To remove a lord's dovecote would mean unraveling legal precedents older than most village churches. That level of reform? Unthinkable. But that doesn't mean people didn't try. In 1335, a small rebellion sparked in a rural commune southwest of Paris. The cause? Birds. Lots of them. A visiting noble had installed a new dovecote on recently acquired land. Within weeks, his flock of over 1,000 pigeons had decimated nearby barley and turnip fields. The villagers demanded compensation. The noble refused. Tensions rose, and one night, under cover of darkness, the villagers crept into the dovecote and opened all the doors. The pigeons fled. Some were caught, cooked, or never seen again. The rest scattered, confused, into the countryside. The punishment? Brutal. Not only were fines issued, but several villagers were flogged publicly. The dovecote was rebuilt, larger than before, as a warning. Historians still argue whether this counts as a true peasant revolt or just an unusually organized bird-related tantrum. But the message was clear. Mess with the birds, and you're messing with the system. You pass through a small orchard now. Apple blossoms drift on the breeze, and somewhere in the trees, more pigeons roost. They're quiet here, almost reverent. Maybe they know their place in the history of resentment. Or maybe they're just digesting someone's wheat. The field opens again, and ahead you see a farmhouse with a tiny wooden shack beside it. Not a dovecote, just a tool shed. But you wonder if, centuries ago, someone might have tried to sneak a few pigeons in there. Just enough to raise for meat. Just enough to maybe pretend, for a moment, that they had a little nobility in their blood. Because in this world, pigeon rights weren't just about birds. They were a feudal fingerprint, a way to tell at a glance who owned the land and who merely borrowed it. And as you drift farther into the fields, the stars brighter now, you realize something. In medieval France, the air wasn't free. Even the sky was feudal. You continue along a narrow, muddy path that winds past a small chapel, its roof sagging slightly under age and moss. A candle flickers behind a stained glass window, casting a faint red glow over a bird perched peacefully on the sill. Another pigeon. Of course. And this one might belong to the church dot, because here's where things get particularly divine. You're about to discover that it wasn't just nobles who claimed feathery privilege. Monasteries, those quiet contemplative places paved with prayer, ink-stained manuscripts, and the faint smell of boiled cabbage, were also in on the pigeon game. In fact, some of them were the worst offenders. You turn your gaze to the squat stone building tucked behind the chapel. That's no mere barn. That's a monastic dovecote. And the monks who lived here didn't just chant psalms and brew ale. They managed vast flocks of pigeons with all the righteous zeal of tax accountants during Lent. Monastic dovecotes could rival noble ones in size and grandeur. Some had more birds than the surrounding village had people. Why? Because monks had needs, or at least that's what the church claimed. Pigeons provided meat during fasting periods when beef and pork were forbidden, but bird wasn't, thanks to a conveniently flexible interpretation of ecclesiastical dietary rules. They also delivered excellent fertilizer for monastic gardens and vineyards, another divine loophole that gave monks yet another feathered advantage. Now, here's the funny bit. The church wasn't supposed to compete with secular lords. Technically, they were on the same team, or at least on different playing fields. But pigeon ownership blurred the lines. Some monasteries gained reputations for breeding excessive numbers of birds, far more than they needed for religious purposes. Locals started muttering. Jokes spread. One chronicler even called a certain abbey's dovecote an avian empire of the pious. You smirk at that one dot, and peasants weren't laughing. Monastic pigeons were just as hungry as noble ones. They raided fields, spoiled grain, and left droppings that smelled no more holy than anyone else's. Worse, trying to complain was delicate, because you weren't just criticizing your landlord anymore. You were challenging God's representatives on earth. Risky business. So what did the monks do when villagers pushed back? They preached. Seriously. They'd hold sermons reminding everyone that suffering in this life was part of divine order, that the pigeons were symbols of peace, of the Holy Spirit, that enduring their nibbling was a form of pious patience. Some even quoted scripture. Consider the birds of the air, they'd say, conveniently skipping the part about how God feeds them without taxing the wheat fields of the already starved. Still, historians note that not all monastic orders were exploitative. Some genuinely tried to balance flock size with fairness. Others offered grain to their tenants in compensation, or at least tried to restrict when and where their birds could fly. But those efforts varied widely. And enforcement, well, that depended on whether your abbot was a pragmatist or just really liked pigeon stew. You walk past the dovecote now. It's simpler than the noble ones. Stone walls, no elaborate carvings, just functional holes in a slightly crooked roof. But don't be fooled. This humble structure might have once housed hundreds of birds, and each of those birds represented a frustrating irony. The divine preaching moderation while pooping on your livelihood. And here's a quirky aside. Some monasteries raised albino pigeons, pure white, symbolically sacred. These birds were occasionally used in ceremonies, released during festivals, or even during burials. Imagine standing at a funeral, weeping quietly when a pure white bird flaps overhead, only for everyone to realize it's from the monastery dovecote and probably just looking for bread crusts. Back on the road, your feet carry you past the edge of the monastic garden. The soil looks rich, tilled, and thriving, and you can't help but think, yeah, pigeon poop had its perks. Guano wasn't just waste, it was power. The high nitrogen content made it one of the most valuable fertilizers of the age, ideal for vineyards, herb gardens, even medicinal plants. Monasteries that controlled good dovecotes could maintain healthier gardens, which meant better medicines, stronger wines, and more trade leverage. Historians still argue whether the monks' pigeon operations were more about spirituality or sheer agricultural savvy. Probably both. But it's hard to ignore that flocks often ballooned far beyond what a modest abbey would reasonably need for sustenance and sacraments. Now, let's not give monks all the credit. They weren't the only religious figures feather deep in this mess. Bishops and cathedral chapters had their own flocks, too. And while their dovecotes were usually smaller, their political weight meant they could throw around plenty of influence when it came to pigeon law. A village priest might be sympathetic to your trampled oats, but try to file a complaint up the chain, and you'd be lucky to escape with your soul intact and your taxes unmoved. It's worth noting that even among monks, pigeon management wasn't universally beloved. In one monastic diary from Burgundy, a frustrated friar scribbled a note. The birds have returned from their flight, and with them their endless filth. He then underlined filth 3 times. So yes, even within the cloistered walls of devotion, pigeon politics got messy. You pause again, beneath an olive tree, now far from the dovecote. The night has deepened. A gentle wind rustles through the leaves, and a single feather drifts down onto your boot, soft, weightless, inevitable. Because that's what the pigeons were, in a way, inevitable. Whether perched on a baron's keep or circling a quiet monastery, they hovered above medieval life like tiny feathered judges, untouchable, sacred, and usually annoying. You keep walking, gently brushing the feather away. And with every step, you feel a little closer to understanding how deeply this strange bird had burrowed into the bones of feudal life. As the stars shimmer above, it's clear. In 14th century France, even holiness had wings. The road turns again, this time drawing you toward the outskirts of a sleepy hamlet. Thatched roofs huddle close together, their chimneys exhaling faint ribbons of smoke into the night air. A lone dog barks once in the distance and then gives up, probably realizing no one in their right mind is walking around after dark, except maybe you. And of course, the pigeons. They're here too, always are, nestled in the rafters of barns, perched on the ridgelines of cottages, roosting in church eaves. They're the quiet, fluttering background of daily life. And this little village you're approaching, it's not just sleepy. It's historically significant in its own strange, flapping way. Because tonight, you're standing on land that was once part of a region with one of the earliest recorded anti-pigeon ordinances. Yes, that's right. Even in the feudal fog of 14th century Paris and its surrounding territories, there were people who'd had enough. This village, let's call it Saint-Remy-sur-Oise, might have been tiny, but the peasants here knew exactly how many birds it took to turn patience into protest. And when the flock from a nearby noble estate began demolishing their spring sprouts year after year. They did something unusual. They made noise. Not just grumbling. Legal noise. You step past a low fence and picture the town council convening. A few men, farmers mostly, maybe a blacksmith, gathered under the village linden tree, their brows furrowed, their hats in hand. They weren't trying to start a war. They just wanted to stop the birds from eating next season's rent. And so they wrote to the regional bailiff, a polite, if exasperated letter. The gist: Your Grace, with all due respect, the pigeons are eating us alive. More formally, they requested a restriction on the number of birds allowed in the local noble's dovecote. They even proposed a compromise: limit the flights to certain months, or require that grain be left out to distract the birds. The response: laughter. Well, metaphorical laughter. The bailiff denied the request, citing the rights of noble inheritance and the natural flight of God's creatures. Classic. But the seed was planted. This wasn't the only village to raise a complaint, and soon more towns began doing the same. Over the next few decades, scattered petitions cropped up from Burgundy, Champagne, Normandy, all echoing the same grievances. It wasn't just the crops. It was the injustice, the helplessness, the gall of being told you couldn't even protect your own food from a bird wearing an invisible crown dot. And here's where it gets weird. A few villages didn't wait for permission. They created their own rules. Local ordinances, not approved by any higher noble, were scribbled into town records. Things like, no bird belonging to a lord shall be permitted to roost in this village past midsummer, or any pigeon caught feasting in communal gardens may be detained. Yes, detained, like a feathered criminal. The punishments weren't exactly violent, at least not at first. Birds were trapped and relocated. Some were branded with paint to identify repeat offenders. A few were, let's say, accidentally cooked. You pass a wooden sign, long faded. If you squint, you can still make out a symbol, a pigeon with a line through it. Half a joke, half a warning. You get the sense that, back then, this was a town that had declared itself a pigeon-free zone, whether the nobles liked it or not. Historians still argue whether these unofficial bans had any real legal standing or were just local bravado. Some say they were performative, a way to feel empowered in a world where you owned nothing but your complaints. Others suggest they sparked early ideas of common law autonomy, tiny, feathery acts of rebellion that eventually contributed to broader challenges against the feudal order. And then, of course, there were the noble responses. You continue past a crumbling stone wall, once the edge of a manor estate. The pigeons from that manor, according to the old tales, were the most aggressive in the region, not just hungry, militant. Villagers swore they could sense when harvest was near and descended like fluffy locusts, pecking and stomping and leaving chaos in their wake. The local baron, he wasn't sympathetic. He reportedly had a steward make a public speech. The pigeons are my inheritance, as the moon is to the night, which, okay, is poetic, but also wildly unhelpful. What came next? A slow, smoldering standoff. No one drew swords, but fields were left unguarded at strategic times. Bird feeders mysteriously disappeared. A dovecote was vandalized, its perch cut in half so birds couldn't land properly. No one was caught, of course. No one ever was. One friar passing through the village in 1391 wrote in his travel diary, "I saw no less than 5 pigeons slain and hung like heretics upon a line." The message was not subtle. No, it wasn't. And still, the law remained on the side of the birds' owners. Even minor damage to a nobleman's flock, throwing rocks, setting traps, or even scaring them too aggressively, could lead to trial. Some courts even classified pigeon harming as a form of property destruction. You could be fined, publicly humiliated, or worse. In one rural case, a man was sentenced to a week in the stocks with a wooden pigeon nailed to the board beside his head. But the villagers kept resisting. By the end of the 14th century, debates over pigeon rights had become so widespread that even royal advisors were beginning to whisper about it. Not out of empathy, of course, but out of fear that too many angry peasants might shift their frustration from birds to bigger targets. You're approaching a small bridge now, the stream below chuckling softly to itself. A group of pigeons takes flight from its railing, startled by your presence. Their wings rustle like crumpling paper. You pause and smile. They don't know about the history they carry in those wings, about the laws once written in their favor, about the angry farmers who dared to draw a line in the straw. And maybe that's the real irony. The birds were just birds. They didn't ask to become symbols of hierarchy or injustice. They just wanted seeds. But by doing what pigeons do best, eating, nesting, returning home, they became unwilling agents in a quiet, stubborn revolution. You cross the bridge and step into the heart of the village, the wind tugging gently at your cloak. The stars above are bright tonight, and the pigeons have settled once more, sleeping in rafters, curled beneath gables, nestled into the corners of history. Your path leads uphill now, where the houses thin out and the trees lean closer, forming a kind of cathedral made of bark and breeze. The air here smells different, cleaner, more like pine and damp earth. Somewhere overhead, wings flutter again, always with the wings. At this point, you'd be more surprised not to hear a pigeon passing by. As you ascend, the terrain starts to shift. The countryside here isn't just farmland, it's royal territory. You're approaching the edge of a royal forest, one of many scattered across 14th century France, meticulously maintained for the pleasure and protection of the crown. You probably shouldn't be here. Royal Forest had rules, strict ones. And guess who didn't like rules? Pigeons. You step carefully around a gnarled root and catch sight of something ahead, a crumbling stone marker half buried in ivy. It's faint, but you can just make out a carved crown and the old French word chasse, hunting ground. This land back then belonged to the king. And yes, even the king had pigeons. The royal dovecotes were grander than anything you've seen so far. Massive, beautifully built, and manned by an entire team of servants whose sole job was to pamper and protect a royal flock. Some of these dovecotes could hold upwards of 3,000 birds. You could practically hear the tax money flapping. You might wonder, why did kings care so much about pigeons? They didn't need the meat. They had armies of hunters and fishmongers. They didn't need the fertilizer either. But the pigeons served another purpose: control. Keeping flocks was a visual declaration of supremacy. If you were a noble, your dovecote told people you had land and power. But if you were the king, your dovecote told people you owned the concept of land and power. It was like wearing a crown that flew around and pooped on your subjects with impunity. And just like with noble flocks, royal pigeons were protected by law. Harming a king's pigeon wasn't just property damage. It was a form of treason. Think about that. One arrow aimed too high at the wrong time, and you could find yourself accused of conspiring against the crown. All for trying to save your barley from a royal bird buffet. Now, historians still argue whether the penalties were enforced strictly or just used to scare the peasantry into submission. But records show that several unlucky farmers were brought before royal courts after pigeon incidents. The verdicts usually involved fines, grain, forfeitures, or temporary imprisonment. One chronicled case even mentions a peasant being forced to kneel before a dovecote and publicly apologize to the king's good birds. Try not to laugh too hard at that one. It probably wasn't funny to the guy who had to do it. You stop now at the edge of a clearing where an old oak stands, its trunk wider than a wagon, its branches a tangle of shadows above. This spot, according to legend, once hosted an annual royal hunt. Nobles gathered here in silk and velvet, hoping to win favor by riding well, shooting straight, and not embarrassing themselves in front of their sovereign. Meanwhile, the pigeons? They watch from the trees, smug and untouchable. Because here's a weird historical twist. Pigeons were sometimes used during royal hunts, not as prey, but as training bait. Falcons and hawks, prized by the nobility, were trained using pigeons as live targets. It's brutal, sure, but that was falconry. Status sport meets meat grinder dot. But even in that context, not all pigeons were fair game. The falconers had to get permission, sometimes even written approval, to borrow a few birds for training. And they had to make sure those pigeons didn't come from someone's protected flock. Killing the wrong pigeon could trigger an entire legal inquiry, because nothing says medieval justice like a courtroom debate over whose bird exploded mid-flight. Fringe fact alert. In a particularly strange case near Poitiers, a knight once tried to settle a land dispute by claiming that his pigeons had been chased off by a rival's more aggressive flock. The court, genuinely baffled, summoned witnesses to testify about the bird's behavior. The result? A territorial compromise that included the shared use of a dovecote. Yes, they literally shared custody of pigeons. You lean against the oak tree and take a breath. Even the wind here feels regal. It whispers through the leaves in a low, steady rhythm, like the forest is remembering the stories you're hearing. Pigeons weren't just pets. They were political pawns, economic tools, and social messengers. And in royal hands, they became part of a living spectacle, a feathered extension of statecraft. Now let's talk about their symbolic value. Kings loved pigeons because they represented peace. Yes, even while being trained to dodge falcons and destroy crops. It's a bit ironic. The royal seal often featured a dove, white and graceful, hovering above Latin inscriptions about divine rule and heavenly favor. And yet, in practice, that dove might have spent most of its life dive bombing a peasant's lentils. But hey, perception over reality, right? And even among the nobility, there were pigeon politics. If a minor baron's flock trespassed into royal land, it was more than an annoyance. It could be seen as a challenge to the crown's dominion. Several recorded disputes involved letters between royal stewards and local lords, accusing each other's birds of wandering too freely. Imagine writing an official document about feathered trespassers, and then imagine sealing it with wax and sending it via horseback. Truly, bureaucracy knows no limits. You start walking again. The trees begin to thin as the trail slopes downward. The moon has risen higher, casting silver shadows across the underbrush. You hear a low coo nearby, soft, like a lullaby for the forest. And somehow, despite everything, it's peaceful. Because here's the thing. The pigeons didn't know they were royal, or noble, or peasant. They just flew. They nested. They ate. They returned home, over and over, like little wind-up machines fluttering through a world that made them more important than they could ever understand. And now, as you step out of the forest and onto open land once more, you realize, in 14th century France, a pigeon could start a feud, end a lawsuit, or land you in the stocks. Not bad for a bird that can't tell time. The night air carries you down a hill now, the trail softening beneath your feet as the soil shifts into loam. Good farming land. You can almost feel the grooves of plowed furrows beneath the darkness, and you picture fields stretching outward in neat rows, waiting for spring. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots once, and then silence again, except for the ever-familiar sound of pigeons rustling in the eaves of a nearby barn. As always, they're here before you, and they'll be here long after. Because the pigeons, for all their puffed chests and constant pecking, had one thing going for them in medieval France: the law. Tonight, we dig into the actual legal documents, the dusty scrolls, the Latin clauses, the margins scrawled by sleepy clerks with ink-stained fingers. These weren't just vague traditions. Pigeon protection was written down. It had rules, binding ones. If you were a lord in 14th century Paris or the surrounding countryside, your dovecote wasn't just a nice accessory. It was a legal right, encoded in feudal law, and fiercely protected by both custom and bureaucracy. And the most important piece of this legal puzzle, the right of colombier. That's your new favorite term for the evening. Colombier being the French word for a dovecote. But not just any dovecote. A colombier apide, the freestanding, towering kind, signified more than pigeon ownership. It meant feudal status. The right to own and operate one of these wasn't granted lightly. It was reserved for the high nobility, those with the bloodlines, landholdings, and political muscle to justify it. And if you had one, congratulations. That meant your land was officially a seigneurie. You weren't just rich, you were legally part of the landed gentry. All thanks to a round stone building full of feathery freeloaders. But for peasants and commoners, the law was very, very different. You pass a weathered gate now. Its hinges rusted, and beyond, it lies a small cottage with a chicken coop. Inside, hens, maybe a few ducks, but definitely no pigeons. That's not an accident. For centuries, it was illegal for commoners to build a columbier unless they were specifically granted permission by a higher authority, usually the king or a powerful noble dot. And the penalty for breaking that rule: destruction of the structure, seizure of property, and possibly a stiff fine or worse. No one wanted the system getting muddy. If everyone could keep pigeons, what would it mean to be noble? Now, here's a quirky side note. Loopholes did exist. Some crafty townsfolk managed to get around the restrictions by building pigeon houses that weren't technically columbiers, small boxes on poles, hidden rooftop perches, or coops disguised as storage sheds. Historians even found a record of a miller in Champagne who painted his pigeon boxes to look like chimneys just to avoid detection. Bless his clever, flour-dusted heart. Still comma. Enforcement could be ruthless. Local lords had a right to inspect properties, and any unapproved pigeon facilities were swiftly dismantled. You can picture the scene. A pair of bailiffs, noses in the air, sniffing out pigeon contraband like tax-collecting bloodhounds. You stop beside a low stone wall, worn smooth from years of weather and passing sheep. This is where laws like Benalites were enforced. Those feudal duties that tied the peasant to the lord's mill, oven, wine press, and yes, sometimes even the dovecote. In some regions, peasants were forbidden from scaring pigeons away during harvest. That's right, you couldn't defend your crops because the birds were protected under lordly rights. Imagine standing in your barley field, watching a feathery buffet unfold, and knowing that shooing them away might land you in court. That's not just frustrating, it's infuriating. And yet it was the law. Here's something even stranger. The legal terminology evolved alongside architecture. In the 14th century, the number of pigeonholes, the little niches inside a dovecote, sometimes determined how much land the lord was allowed to claim as pigeon rights territory. Think about that. Your dovecote wasn't just a structure, it was a calculator. More holes meant more birds, and more birds meant more implied control of the surrounding fields. One legal code from the Ile-de-France region even specified that the number of roosts shall not exceed that which the land can sustain, which sounds fair, until you remember that lords defined what the land could sustain. Spoiler alert, historians still argue whether these legal protections were rigorously enforced across all territories. Some suggest that in poorer or more remote regions, enforcement was lax. Others argue that lords made examples of scofflaws precisely to maintain the appearance of control. After all, a dovecote wasn't just about birds, it was a symbol of dominion, and symbols have to be defended. You cross into another patch of open ground now. No buildings, just tufts of grass, some slanted fence posts, and the wind. This might have once been part of a common pasture, a shared space where villagers grazed animals. But even commons weren't safe from pigeon-related legislation. In some areas, laws stated that any grain accidentally planted too close to a lord's dovecote became fair game for the birds, and you couldn't complain, because technically you were the one trespassing. You laugh under your breath. Pigeon law was basically medieval gaslighting. Oh, your rye got eaten? Well, perhaps you shouldn't have grown it so deliciously. And in towns, the rules got even more absurd. Municipal records from Paris show that city dwellers often tried to claim bird-related damages to property, like droppings ruining laundry or pigeons nesting in attics. But complaints rarely succeeded. The birds, after all, were protected, and more than that, they were often owned by people above your pay grade. At this point, you might be wondering, was there any recourse? Any moment in 14th century pigeon law where the little guy won? Actually, yes. Just once in a while, the courts ruled in favor of the peasantry. In 1378, for instance, a village near Lyon successfully argued that a noble's dovecote was excessive and injurious to the balance of agricultural output. Basically, their entire harvest had been turned into an avian salad bar. The judge ruled that the number of birds had to be reduced, not eliminated, of course. That would be heresy, but reduced. It was a rare victory, and word of it spread like wildfire. Other villages tried to replicate the case, often with less success, but it proved something. Even stone laws could crack. You reach the top of a low rise now and look back over the moonlit fields. There's a dovecote in the distance, a squat, round silhouette against the sky. It stands like a forgotten tower, guarding nothing but memory and bird droppings. In the end, the pigeons were just doing what pigeons do. But the laws that protected them, those were crafted by hands that feared losing control. Because in a world held together by titles and bloodlines, even a bird could be a building block. You descend from the rise, gravel crunching underfoot, the landscape stretching wide around you like a worn tapestry, stitched with barns, tangled hedgerows, and dovecotes looming like little medieval lighthouses. The stars shimmer more brightly now, undimmed by smoke or torchlight. Out here, away from Paris proper, the laws still ruled, but enforcement softened with distance. What stayed consistent, though, was the rivalry, because even among the bird-blessed elite, pigeon rights weren't a settled matter. Tonight, you're walking into a world of flapping feuds, territorial disputes, and passive-aggressive pigeon placement. Welcome to the subtle and sometimes ridiculous realm of noble-on-noble pigeon drama. You pass a fork in the road. Left leads toward the ruins of an old manor. Right, toward what used to be a rival estate. The two lords who once lived here, they hated each other, and not over love, or land, or cattle. It was all about pigeons. These two estates, let's call them Montvenin and Cordeille, had been feuding for decades. The issue? Overlapping pigeon territories. See, pigeons aren't known for their political awareness. They go where the grain is. So when the Montvenin birds started frequenting Cordeille fields, things got tense. The Lord of Cordeille filed a formal complaint, accusing Montvenin of excessive flight and unlawful encouragement. In other words, he thought his neighbor was training the birds to raid enemy crops. Like feathered mercenaries. Montvenin naturally denied the claim, countering that his pigeons merely followed their instincts as ordained by nature and God. The courts, yes, actual courts, got involved. Pages of testimony, drawn maps of dovecote proximity, even witnesses who swore they saw pigeons deliberately swoop southward. Historians still argue whether the whole affair was a pretext for land grabs or just good old-fashioned aristocratic pettiness. But here's the kicker. The judge ordered a temporary bird buffer zone. That's right. Each lord had to restrict his birds from flying beyond a designated boundary, like medieval airspace control. Naturally, it failed. Because, as you probably noticed by now, pigeons can't read. And this wasn't an isolated case. Dozens of records survive detailing similar disputes. Lords bickering over pigeon poaching, accusing neighbors of building their dovecotes too tall so birds would fly farther, or even breeding unusually aggressive birds to scare rival flocks. One baron from Brittany swore his neighbor's pigeons were bigger and meaner because they were secretly crossbred with hawks. Scientists today say that's unlikely, but back then, it sounded like espionage. You pause under an elm tree, its bare branches twisting above you. In its shadow, you imagine one of those noble meetings. Two grim men in cloaks, trying to discuss a bird truce while the birds continue to casually trample a poor farmer's lentils behind them. Pigeon rivalries weren't just about crops. They were about honor. Dovecotes were visible symbols, like flags or coats of arms. Your dovecote cast a shadow on your neighbor's estate. It was the architectural equivalent of throwing down a gauntlet, and some lords built extra floors onto theirs just to make that shadow stretch farther. Here's a fringe fact for you. In southern France, one noble family carved their crest into the stone of their dovecote, facing the direction of their enemy's land, as a kind of eternal stone stink eye. That's commitment. These rivalries could even influence marriages. One chronicled union between two minor houses included a specific clause in the dowry agreement. No member of the House of Du Ferte shall restrict the flight of pigeons from Colombier de la Fosse. In-laws with bird lawyers. What a time to be alive, Dot. And while these disputes seem laughable now, they mattered deeply at the time. Pigeon rights were tied to land rights, which meant tax rights, tenant responsibilities, and local influence. If you couldn't control your birds, how could you control your vassals? But sometimes, bird wars escalated. Dot. You reach the remnants of an old dovecote now, half collapsed, ivy strangling its base. Imagine it in its prime, 2 stories tall, hundreds of niches, a spinning perch atop the roof so pigeons could land no matter which way the wind blew. Its destruction, according to local lore, wasn't caused by age, but by sabotage. Dot. Apparently Kama 1 rival lord had it pulled down during a border skirmish, not to take land, but to humble his neighbor's birds. Brutal and petty. Dot. Still, Kama, these feuds weren't always bad news for the locals. Sometimes, if 2 lords hated each other enough, they became too busy to enforce strict pigeon laws. They ignored minor violations, looked the other way, A few peasants in those regions got away with small flocks, or even built hidden dovecotes in barns, trading eggs and squab meat discreetly. You smile at the image. A clever farmer playing both sides, offering the occasional pigeon to each lord while pretending to hate birds as much as everyone else. A very medieval version of keeping your enemies close and your dinner closer. Historians still argue whether pigeon feuds destabilized regions or helped decentralize power. Some believe these rivalries weakened feudal unity. Others argue they provided useful pressure relief, nobles taking out their frustrations on birds instead of each other. Feathered conflict as a substitute for actual war. And while no one ever marched into battle over pigeon rights, at least not that we know of, some treaties between minor houses included specific lines about bird ownership, flight paths, or dovecote height. Imagine hammering out a peace accord and stopping midway to argue about whose birds get Tuesday access to the barley field dot. As you leave the ruins behind, a breeze rustles through the grass, and you hear it again. That soft, rhythmic cooing. A whole chorus of it from somewhere just out of sight. You turn your head slightly, and yes, there they are. Dozens of pigeons roosting in the crags of the old wall, heads tucked beneath wings. They don't care who won. They never did. The lords are long gone. Their estates crumbled, their names forgotten. But the pigeons, still here, still flying dot, still at the heart of medieval France's strangest turf wars.